There is something most men never learn, and it has nothing to do with looks, money, or status. It is a shift in how you relate to yourself, and once that shift happens, everything about how you connect with women changes. Not because you picked up a trick, but because you became someone genuinely different. Stick with me to the end, because what we are about to walk through is not a quick fix. It is the actual foundation underneath every connection that has ever lasted. Today, I want to talk about what actually creates deep, lasting attraction. Not the games, not the tactics, not the things people whisper about online promising shortcuts to someone else's heart. The real thing. The thing that makes a woman feel something genuine, something she cannot quite explain, something that has nothing to do with manipulation and everything to do with who you are choosing to become. I want to be honest with you before we go further. So much of what circulates online about attraction is framed as a way to gain power over someone else's emotions. Language like making her obsessed, making her chase, controlling her attention. I want no part of that framing, and I do not think you do either. Because underneath the desire to learn this, what most people actually want is not control over another person. It is the experience of real connection, something mutual. Something that does not require strategy because it is simply true. That is what we are actually talking about. Let us start with something foundational, something so simple it gets overlooked constantly. Presence. When a woman feels truly seen by you, not just noticed, not just acknowledged, but understood at a level that goes beyond words, something shifts in how she experiences you. This is not about flattery. It is not about performing a script. It is about a simple human truth. People, women included, crave recognition, not of their surface, but of their essence. Think about how rare that actually is. Most people are distracted in conversation, scanning the room, half listening, already forming their next sentence while the other person is still speaking. They are physically present and emotionally somewhere else entirely. People feel that. They sense when someone's attention is divided, when the exchange feels transactional instead of real. But when you actually show up, when you offer someone the rare gift of your full attention, you communicate something powerful. You matter. What you say matters. Who you are matters. This is not only about romance, it is about basic human dignity. All of us want to be witnessed, to have someone look at us and see the complexity, the contradictions, the unspoken hopes underneath the surface. When you offer that to a woman, when you listen to understand rather than to respond, you create a connection that goes far past anything superficial. Most men skip this entirely. They are focused on impressing, proving, performing. But the man who has learned real presence stands apart, not because he is the loudest voice in the room, but because he is the most genuine one in it. So what does it actually look like to make someone feel seen? It starts with eye contact, the kind that says, "I am here with you," fully, not the unsettling, unblinking kind, but a calm, grounded gaze. Eye contact is one of the most intimate forms of human connection we have. It creates a direct line past small talk and into something more honest. When you hold someone's gaze with quiet steadiness, you communicate stability and sincerity. You are not scanning the room for something better. You are not nervously glancing away. You are simply there. And that kind of presence has its own quiet gravity. Then there is listening, the real kind. Most people do not actually listen. They wait for their turn to speak. But when you listen with the intention to understand rather than to reply, you notice things most people miss. The nuance in someone's voice, the pause between their words, the things left unsaid. When you reflect that back, when you ask thoughtful questions, when you show real curiosity about someone's inner world, you give them something rare. You make them feel real in a world that often treats people as obstacles or backdrops to someone else's story. Notice how different that feels from the kind of listening most of us are used to, the kind where someone nods along while quietly waiting for a gap to insert their own story. Real listening has almost no urgency in it. It does not need to redirect the conversation back to you. It simply stays with the other person a little longer than feels socially necessary. And that small extension of attention is often what people remember long after the conversation ends. And here is the part that matters most. This cannot be a tactic. It cannot be something you perform to win someone over. The moment it becomes strategy instead of sincerity, it falls apart, because people can feel the difference between genuine interest and a well-rehearsed approach. You have to actually care about understanding her. You have to be willing to step outside your own self-interest, even briefly, and enter someone else's world without an agenda. That is the real difference between a person who leaves a lasting impression and one who fades quietly into the background of someone's memory. This matters psychologically because when you make a woman feel genuinely seen, you are speaking to one of the deepest human needs there is, the need to be valued for who you actually are, not for what you can offer, not for how you look, but for the person underneath all of that. Being wanted and being valued are not the same thing, and most people, if they are honest, can feel the difference instantly. Where many men go wrong is believing connection comes from grand gestures or clever lines. It does not. It is built in small, quiet moments, the way you lean in when someone speaks, the way you remember a small detail they mentioned days earlier, the way you make someone feel important without saying a single dramatic word. Those moments accumulate, and over time they form a story in someone's mind. This person actually sees me. And once that story takes root, it tends to stay. So here is something worth carrying with you. The next time you are with someone you care about, actually be there, not just physically, but mentally and emotionally. Listen as though their words genuinely matter, because they do. Look at them like they are worth your full attention, not because you are trying to gain something, but because you recognize their humanity, their effort, their quiet strength that so often goes unnoticed. When you offer that kind of presence, you do not just make someone feel good in the moment. You give them something far more lasting, the experience of being truly known. Now let us talk about something that gets badly misunderstood in modern dating culture: the idea of chemistry and intrigue. There is a real psychological truth here, separate from any kind of strategy or game. Human beings naturally feel more pulled toward things that unfold gradually, that involve some sense of discovery, rather than things handed over all at once with nothing left to learn. This is not unique to romance. It is true of stories, of music, of almost anything that holds our attention over time. The mind enjoys a little space to wonder, and that space is part of what keeps curiosity alive. But here is where this gets twisted by a lot of advice out there. Some people take that truth and turn it into a tactic, a way to manufacture distance on purpose, to manipulate someone's emotions by controlling how available they appear. That is not what we are talking about here, and it matters to separate the two clearly. Genuine intrigue is not something you fake. It is something that naturally exists when you are an actual person with depth, with your own life, your own goals, your own sense of direction. The healthiest version of this is not about being unavailable as a strategy. It is about not outsourcing your sense of wholeness to another person's attention. A man who has his own purpose, his own interests, his own path he is walking, naturally brings something more compelling to a relationship than a man who has nothing going on outside of waiting for her to respond. That is not manipulation. That is simply what it looks like to be a fully developed person. When you have a full life, you are not chasing reassurance from her constantly, and that is not a technique either. It is just the natural result of being someone who feels relatively whole on their own. A woman can sense the difference between a man who is engaged with her because his life is rich and he is choosing to include her in it, versus a man who needs her involvement to feel okay. One feels like an invitation. The other can feel like pressure, even if neither person consciously names it that way. This is not about playing games or pretending not to care. It is not about being cold or hard to reach as some kind of strategy. It is about genuinely building a life that means something to you, so that your attention, when you give it, is meaningful because it is a choice and not a void you are trying to fill. And here is something deeper that often gets missed. Real depth is not static. People are drawn to others who are still growing, still curious, still working on something. If you are stagnant, if your life is not moving in any particular direction, that absence is felt too, regardless of how present or available you are. Growth itself is part of what makes someone interesting to be around, not as a performance, but as an honest expression of being alive and engaged with your own existence. You can feel this in conversation almost immediately. A person who is actively learning something, working through something, building towards something, brings a kind of energy into the room that simply cannot be faked by someone who has stopped moving. This matters even within long-term relationships, not just in early dating. Connection is not something you secure once and then stop tending to. It continues to be shaped by both people continuing to grow, continuing to bring new parts of themselves into the relationship, continuing to choose each other actively rather than coasting on momentum. When growth stops entirely, something in the relationship often goes quiet too, not because anyone did anything wrong, but because stagnation tends to feel that way for most people. So if there is a practical takeaway here, it is this. Build a life that feels meaningful to you, independent of whether anyone else is watching or responding. Stay curious about your own growth. Then, when you do show up for someone, show up fully, with presence and real attention, and return to your own path with the same wholeness you brought with you. That balance, full presence paired with a full life of your own, tends to create something far more sustainable than any tactic ever could. Now let us talk about something else women genuinely respond to, something that goes beyond comfort or even passion. Many women describe wanting to feel inspired by the person they are with, not controlled, not managed, but genuinely inspired to grow alongside someone who is also trying to become more of who they are capable of being. This is where a lot of men misunderstand what makes a good partner. Some believe that being endlessly agreeable, never pushing back, creating a completely frictionless dynamic is what makes someone easy to love. But agreeableness without honesty is not partnership. It is passivity, and passivity rarely creates lasting attraction. People generally do not fall deeply for those who have no real perspective of their own. They tend to be drawn to those who stand for something, who have a clear sense of values, and who care enough to be honest, even when honesty is uncomfortable. There is something powerful about a relationship where both people genuinely want each other to grow, not through criticism or pressure, but through honest reflection and real support. Human beings tend to thrive when they feel both accepted as they are and gently encouraged toward who they could become. That is not about molding someone into your own image. It is about believing in their potential and being willing to say the honest thing instead of just the comfortable thing. But here is the most important part of this entire idea. You cannot ask someone else to grow if you yourself are standing still. You cannot encourage honesty in someone else while avoiding your own hard truths. This is why working on yourself is not a selfish pursuit. It might be one of the most generous things you can offer a relationship. When you are actively confronting your own fears, taking responsibility for your own life and continuing to grow, it creates space for the other person to want to meet you there, not because you demanded it, but because growth tends to be contagious when it is genuine. In practice, this might look like having the courage to gently name something honestly, instead of just nodding along to keep the peace. It might mean encouraging someone to take a risk they have been avoiding. It might mean being compassionate towards someone's struggles while still being honest about patterns that are not serving them. This requires real balance, being honest without being harsh, caring enough to say the hard thing without using it as a weapon. When this balance is done well, something good tends to happen. The other person does not usually feel attacked. They tend to feel respected, like someone actually paid enough attention to tell them the truth instead of just what was easiest to say. And often, they end up respecting themselves a little more because of it. There is something worth noting here, too. People tend to rise toward what is genuinely expected of them in a healthy relationship, and they tend to settle when nothing is expected at all. This is not about pressuring someone into being who you want them to be. It is about holding a sincere belief in someone's potential and letting that belief show up in how you treat them, with honesty, with encouragement, and with real care. This requires real maturity on your part, the willingness to risk someone's momentary discomfort for the sake of long-term honesty, and the security to know that connection is not only about being agreeable in every moment, It is about being someone worth trusting over the long run. A lot of men avoid this because conflict feels uncomfortable, but the strongest relationships generally are not the ones without any friction at all. They are the ones where friction gets used constructively instead of being avoided entirely or weaponized. If you want to put this into practice, start with your own life first. You cannot meaningfully encourage someone else's growth while neglecting your own. Start seeing the people you care about not only as they are in this moment, but with genuine belief in who they are capable of becoming. Have the courage to be honest, gently and consistently, rather than either silent or harsh. And when growth happens, notice it. Acknowledge it. Recognition tends to reinforce the very change you hoped to see. Now, finally, let us talk about something that quietly underlies all of this. Self-respect. Not arrogance, not bravado, but a steady internal sense that you are enough, independent of whether someone else validates that for you. This is the piece almost nobody talks about directly because it sounds less exciting than chemistry or attraction, but it is the thing that actually holds everything else together once the initial spark fades and real life begins. Think about the people who have left a lasting impression on you in life. Often, what made them memorable was not their appearance or their wealth. It was a kind of grounded conviction, an inner steadiness that did not depend on anyone else's approval to exist. That kind of quiet self-assurance tends to be felt by others almost immediately, in how someone carries themselves, how they speak, how they hold space in a conversation. It does not demand attention, it simply tends to draw it naturally. There is a real psychological reason for this. People generally feel safer around others who seem internally stable. It signals that this is someone who can handle difficulty without falling apart. That sense of steadiness is not about controlling outcomes with someone else. It is entirely about your own relationship with yourself. Here is where a lot of men get this wrong. They try to perform certainty toward a specific woman, hoping it will convince her to choose them. But real self-respect was never about her at all. It is about knowing you are valuable with or without anyone's approval. That distinction is what separates neediness from genuine confidence. A needy person looks outward constantly for reassurance. A self-respecting person already carries it. This shows up in small, honest ways. Someone without self-respect often hesitates before speaking, worried about getting it wrong. Someone grounded in self-respect tends to speak honestly, without obsessing over the reaction. One pattern tends to create distance over time. The other tends to invite closeness, not through effort, but simply through being consistent. In dating specifically, this often looks like the difference between someone who overextends out of fear of losing someone's interest and someone who stays engaged without losing themselves in the process. Not because they do not care, but because their sense of worth was never dependent on any single outcome. And interestingly, that kind of grounded steadiness tends to create more genuine connection, not because it is a strategy, but because comfort with yourself tends to be contagious in any interaction. It is worth saying clearly that this kind of self-respect is not the same as being rigid or closed off. It is not about never being wrong or never changing your mind. In fact, real confidence allows for both, because it is not built on the fragile foundation of always being right. It is built on knowing your worth is not on the line every time you are wrong about something. That flexibility, the ability to adapt without losing your center, is part of what real strength actually looks like. And this kind of self-respect is not something you can fake convincingly for very long. It tends to be built slowly, through real experience, through facing difficult things and getting through them, through developing actual competence and discipline in your own life. That is why personal growth keeps coming up throughout everything we have talked about today. It is not a side note. It is the foundation underneath all of it. If you want to build this in your own life, start by being honest with yourself about where you are seeking validation that you have not yet learned to give yourself. Notice where you are acting from fear instead of genuine conviction. Then build real evidence of your own capability. Take on things that challenge you. Develop real skills. Push past your comfortable edges. Self-respect tends to grow in direct proportion to the difficult things you have actually faced and worked through. If there is one thing worth taking from everything we have talked about today, let it be this. The most meaningful thing you can offer another person is not grand gestures, constant availability, or performed confidence. It is genuine presence, honest growth, and a real sense of self-respect that does not depend on anyone else's approval to exist. Build that, quietly and consistently, and connection tends to follow on its own, not because you chased it, but because you became someone worth genuinely knowing. None of this works as a formula, and that is actually the point. The moment any of this becomes a script you are performing, it loses the very thing that made it meaningful in the first place. Presence, growth, and self-respect are not things you do to someone. They are things you build within yourself, and the natural byproduct of that work tends to be the kind of connection most people spend their whole lives chasing through far more complicated means. It is worth remembering that the people in your life, romantic or otherwise, can usually tell the difference between someone who is trying to extract something from them and someone who genuinely wants to know them. That distinction tends to matter more than any line, any tactic, or any carefully timed gesture ever could. Real connection has never needed a script. It simply needs two people willing to show up honestly, again and again, even on the days when showing up honestly is harder than putting on a performance would be. So if you walk away from this with anything today, let it be a quiet kind of permission. Permission to stop performing, to stop strategizing your way into someone's heart, and to instead focus on becoming the kind of person who does not need to. That shift alone tends to change far more than any tactic ever could, and it tends to ripple outward into every relationship in your life, not only the romantic ones. The friendships get steadier. The family conversations get more honest. Even the way you treat yourself, in the quiet moments nobody else sees, starts to shift, because you are no longer building a version of yourself for an audience. You are simply becoming who you already had the capacity to be all along. And that, more than any technique you could ever learn, is what people actually fall for.